William thought George had come to Diana's memorial simply to stand beside him. Then George reached inside his jacket and pulled out something William had never seen before, and noticed it first. And when George quietly explained why he had brought it, William turned away, because he could no longer hold back his tears. But the most emotional moment came seconds later, when George placed something beside Diana's memorial and whispered, "This is for Granny Diana." And nobody there was prepared for what happened next. Before we reveal what George brought for Diana, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, which city are you watching from? The visit was never supposed to become emotional. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, William had planned a quiet family moment at Diana's memorial, away from cameras, speeches, and ceremony, and came with him. But when George arrived, William immediately noticed something different. His son was unusually quiet. One hand remained tucked inside his jacket. William watched him for several seconds. "Everything all right?" George nodded. "Yeah." But he didn't move his hand. And noticed too. She exchanged a brief look with William, but said nothing. They began walking toward the memorial. William carried flowers and walked beside him. George remained several steps behind. Then William turned. "You're hiding something." George almost smiled. "It's nothing bad." "What is it?" "I'll show you when we get there." That answer only made William more curious. He assumed George had brought flowers of his own. Perhaps a photograph. Maybe something Catherine had helped him prepare. And noticed something else. George wasn't behaving like a boy carrying a surprise. He looked nervous. As they reached the memorial, George stopped. William placed his flowers down and remained beside him. But George didn't approach. Instead, he stood several feet away, staring toward the memorial as though trying to decide whether he could go through with whatever he had planned. William softened his voice. "George." George finally stepped forward, and as he moved, his jacket opened slightly. William caught sight of something inside. Not flowers, not a photograph, an envelope. Old, slightly worn around the edges, and clearly not something George had bought that morning. William's expression changed. "Where did you get that?" George instinctively covered it with his hand and stared at the exposed corner, because there was something about that envelope she recognized. Something from years before George was even born. And when and finally saw the handwriting across the front, she stopped walking and didn't need to see the entire envelope. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, one glimpse of the handwriting was enough to make her expression change. "George, where did you find that?" George looked down at it. "In one of Dad's old boxes." William immediately turned toward him. "What box?" George explained that several family possessions had recently been reorganized. While looking through photographs and old papers, he had discovered the envelope tucked beneath a stack of personal correspondence. He hadn't opened it at first, but something written across the front caught his attention, and stepped closer. "May I see it?" George handed it to her. The envelope was faded. The edges were worn, and ran her thumb carefully across the handwriting. William watched her face. "You recognize it?" And hesitated. "I recognize the writing." William's expression changed. He took the envelope. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Then George revealed something neither of them expected. "The envelope was empty when I found it," and looked confused. "Then why bring it here?" George reached for it again. "Because it isn't empty anymore." Silence. William looked toward his son. "What did you put inside?" George wouldn't answer. Not yet. He simply said he wanted to leave something at the memorial. Something he'd written himself. And suddenly understood why George had been nervous from the moment he arrived. This wasn't an object he'd casually discovered and decided to return. He had deliberately used an old piece of family history to carry a message of his own. William looked at the handwriting again, then toward Diana's memorial. "Is this for her?" George nodded. Anne's eyes softened, but George wasn't ready to show them what he'd written. He took the envelope back and walked toward the memorial alone. William and Anne stayed behind. George reached the flowers, stopped, then slowly knelt. But instead of simply placing the envelope down, he opened it and pulled out a handwritten page addressed with 2 words. Granny Diana. William saw the words from several steps away. Granny Diana. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, George held the handwritten page carefully, almost as though he wasn't sure whether he wanted anyone else to read it. William took a step forward. George looked back. "Can I do this by myself?" William stopped, and did too. "Of course," William said quietly. George turned toward the memorial. He placed a single white flower down first, then the old envelope, but he kept the letter in his hands. For several seconds, he simply stood there and watched him closely. "He's nervous," she whispered. William nodded. George had heard stories about Diana his entire life. He knew the photographs. He knew she had been his grandmother. But this was different. This was George choosing to speak to someone he had never been able to meet. Finally, he knelt. He unfolded the page. William expected him to place it inside the envelope. Instead, George began reading. Quietly. Too quietly for William and then to hear every word. But then one sentence carried across the silence. "Dad tells us about you." William's expression immediately changed. George continued. He wrote that he knew Diana through photographs, through stories about her humor, and through the memories William had deliberately shared with George, Charlotte, and Louis. Then George stopped. He looked down at the final section and noticed his hesitation. "What did he write there?" she whispered. William didn't know. George finally continued. He explained that there was something he wished he could thank Diana for, even though she had died years before he was born. William looked confused. What could Diana possibly have given George directly? Then George read the next line. His voice trembled slightly, because the thing he wanted to thank Diana for wasn't an object. It wasn't a title, and it wasn't even a royal inheritance. It was something Diana had taught William, and William had unknowingly passed on to his son. William didn't interrupt. Neither did Anne. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, George continued reading the letter he had written to the grandmother he knew only through other people's memories. He wrote about the stories William had told him. Stories that weren't about palaces, or titles, or becoming king. They were about people. George had heard how Diana tried to notice those who felt invisible, how she could make someone feel important simply by stopping and listening, and how William had tried to teach his own children the same lesson. George looked down at the page, then read the line that changed William's expression. "Dad says being royal doesn't make you more important than anyone else." William lowered his head. George continued. He wrote that one day, people might expect him to become king. He didn't know what that would feel like. He didn't know what Britain would look like. But there was one thing he already knew. If that day ever came, he didn't want people to remember only the crown he wore. He wanted them to remember how he treated them. Anne's eyes moved immediately toward William, because she understood where that lesson had begun. George did too. "I think Dad learned some of that from you," he read. "And I learned it from Dad." William's composure began to crack. This wasn't simply George remembering Diana. It was George telling Diana that something she had taught her son had survived long enough to reach a grandson she never met. Then George reached the final paragraph. He hesitated and noticed. William quietly asked, "What does it say?" George looked toward him, then back toward the memorial. The next sentence wasn't about Diana. It was about the kind of king George hoped to become. And when Anne heard it, she immediately covered her mouth and turned away. George looked down at the final paragraph. For several seconds, he couldn't bring himself to read it. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, William remained completely still and watched from beside him. Then George finally began. "If I become king one day, I hope people aren't afraid to talk to me." Anne's expression changed. George continued. He wrote that he didn't want a crown to become a wall between himself and everyone else. He wanted to listen, to notice people, and to remember that the person standing quietly at the back of a room might matter just as much as the person standing at the front. Then came the sentence and wasn't prepared for. "Dad told me you made people feel seen. I hope I can do that too." And covered her mouth. She turned away. William noticed immediately. "Anne." She shook her head. Not because anything was wrong. Because George had unknowingly touched a memory she had carried for years. And remembered Diana not simply as the woman surrounded by cameras, but as someone who could suddenly shift her attention toward the person everyone else had overlooked. And now George was describing that same quality as something he wanted to carry into his own future. 3 generations. One lesson. Diana to William. William to George. And wiped beneath her eye. George looked toward her. "Did I say something wrong?" And immediately shook her head. "No." She managed a small smile. Quite the opposite. William was already emotional. But George still hadn't finished. He turned the page over. There was another paragraph on the back. William hadn't known about it. Neither had Anne. George looked directly at his father before reading. Because this final part wasn't about becoming king. It wasn't about Diana's public legacy. It was about William. And after George read the first sentence, William realized the letter wasn't only a message to the mother he had lost. It was also a thank you to the father who had refused to let his children forget her. George turned the page over. William immediately knew this part was different. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, George wasn't writing about Diana's charity work, her public life, or even the kind of king he hoped to become. He was writing about his father. George began quietly. "I never got to meet you, but Dad makes sure we know you." William looked down. George continued. He wrote about the photographs William had shown him, the stories he told George, Charlotte, and Louis, the funny memories, the difficult ones, and the small details that would never appear in a history book. George explained that because of those stories, Diana didn't feel like a distant royal figure. She felt like family. Then came the sentence William wasn't prepared for. "I think Dad misses you more than he tells us." William turned away and immediately looked at him. For years, William had tried to introduce his children to a grandmother they could never physically know. He could show them photographs, tell them stories, explain what she believed, but he could never know whether those memories truly meant anything to them. Until now, George looked toward his father. "Dad," William wiped his eyes. "Keep going." George read the final lines. He thanked Diana for raising the man who was now raising him. That was enough. William's composure finally broke, and reached for his arm as William lowered his head, tears visible in his eyes. George stopped reading, but William shook his head. "I'm all right." Then George folded the letter. He looked toward Diana's memorial. "There's another reason I wanted to come today." William looked up. "Another reason?" George nodded. The letter wasn't the entire tribute. He had made himself a promise before coming, and he wanted William and Anne to hear it. George stepped toward the memorial again, and what he promised next wasn't about remembering Diana for one afternoon. It was about making sure her memory survived into the generation that would come after him. George stood in front of Diana's memorial with the folded letter still in his hands. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, William assumed his son had already said everything he came to say. He hadn't. George looked toward his father. "I want to promise her something." William's expression changed. "What?" George turned back toward the memorial. He explained that one day, photographs would become older. Stories would become harder to remember. And the people who had actually known Diana would not always be there to tell the next generation what she was really like. And immediately understood where he was going. George didn't want Diana to become simply a name in a history book, or a portrait children walked past without knowing the person behind it. "If I have children one day," George said quietly, "I'll tell them too." William lowered his head. George promised that he would tell them the stories William had told him. How Diana laughed, how she treated ordinary people, how she challenged expectations, and how she remained part of their family even though George had never met her. Anne's eyes filled again, because George wasn't merely promising to remember Diana. He was promising to become another link in the chain. Diana to William, William to George, and someday, perhaps, George to his own children. Then George turned toward Anne. There was something he still didn't understand. "Can I ask you something?" And nodded. George hesitated. When there weren't cameras around, he looked toward Diana's memorial. What was she actually like? William went completely still. That wasn't a question about Princess Diana. It wasn't about headlines, royal duties, or history. George wanted to know about the woman behind all of it, and looked down for several seconds. Then she smiled through the emotion. "I can tell you something your father may never have told you." William looked at her, and stepped closer to George, because after all the famous stories Diana had left behind, and was about to give her great-nephew something much rarer, a small memory of Diana that had never needed an audience, and looked toward Diana's memorial. For a moment, she said nothing. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, George had heard countless stories about Diana the princess, but he had asked Anne about Diana the person. When there were no cameras, George repeated, "What was she like?" and smiled. More ordinary than people imagine. William looked toward her and began describing a small family memory. Not a grand royal occasion, not a state dinner, just an afternoon when plans had gone wrong. Everyone was tired, and Diana had noticed one member of staff standing alone after spending hours helping everyone else. Most people had already started leaving. Diana hadn't. She walked back, sat beside them, and started talking. George listened carefully. What did she say? And shook her head. Nothing extraordinary. That was the point. Diana hadn't gone back because cameras were watching. There weren't any. She hadn't done it because protocol required her to. It didn't. She simply noticed someone everyone else had stopped noticing. William lowered his eyes. George immediately connected the story to his letter. She made them feel seen. And nodded. Exactly. George looked toward the page in his hands. Those were almost the same words he had written without ever hearing in story. That realization hit William hardest. Perhaps George had never met Diana, but somehow, through the lessons William had passed down, he had understood something fundamental about the grandmother he knew only through memories. Then George unfolded his letter again. "What are you doing?" William asked. "Adding something." George knelt beside the memorial and wrote one final sentence beneath everything else. And tried to look. George covered the page. "Not yet." William laughed softly through the emotion. Seconds later, George finished. He stared at what he'd written, then handed the letter to William. William read the new line. His smile disappeared, and leaned closer. And when she saw George's final message, her eyes immediately filled with tears again. William read the sentence again. Then he handed the letter to Anne. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, George had added only a few words after hearing and story. But those words changed the entire tribute. "I wish I had known you, but I'm glad they make sure I still know about you." And stopped. William looked toward George. For years, Diana's memory had survived through photographs, documentaries, ceremonies, and public tributes. But George wasn't talking about any of those things. He meant family stories. William telling him what his mother was like, and sharing memories that had never appeared in newspapers. Charlotte and Louis growing up hearing Diana's name as part of their family, not simply as part of royal history. George folded the letter carefully, then placed it inside the old envelope. He knelt beside the memorial. The envelope went down first, then the single white flower. George remained there for several seconds. No speech, no cameras, nothing rehearsed. William watched silently, and wiped beneath her eye again. Finally, George stood and walked back toward them. William placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ready?" George nodded, then stopped. "Dad," William looked at him. "I want to ask you something." George glanced back toward Diana's memorial. William expected another question about his mother. Instead, George made a request. "Can we come back?" William smiled. "Of course." George shook his head. He meant something more. Not another formal anniversary. Not a public ceremony. Not when royal tradition required them to appear. He wanted them to return privately. Together. And he wanted Charlotte and Louis to come too. "Maybe you can tell us more stories here." William's expression changed again. Because George wasn't asking for another memorial visit. He was asking William to keep doing the one thing his letter had just thanked him for. Keeping Diana alive inside their family. William looked toward Anne, then back toward his son. And before they walked away, he gave George a promise of his own. This would not be the last time they came back together. William didn't answer George immediately. Within this fictional, dramatized royal scenario, he looked back toward Diana's memorial. The white flower, the old envelope, and the handwritten letter resting beside it. Then he looked at his son. "We'll come back." George smiled. But William wasn't promising another ceremony. No photographers. No speeches. No carefully planned royal appearance. This would remain something private. A place where George, Charlotte, and Louis could hear stories about the grandmother they never had the chance to meet. And stood beside them, still visibly emotional. She had arrived expecting a quiet visit. Instead, George had forced both of them to confront something neither had fully realized. Diana's memory had moved beyond the generation that actually knew her. George had never heard her voice. He had never watched her walk into a room. He had never been hugged by her. Yet somehow, he understood something about her. Not because of a title. Not because of photographs. Because William had kept telling the stories. George looked toward the memorial one final time. "Do you think she would have liked the letter?" William struggled to answer. And stepped in. "She would have loved that you wrote it yourself." George smiled. Then the three began walking away. William stopped after several steps. He turned back. The envelope suddenly represented something much bigger than a letter. For years, William had worried that time would slowly turn his mother into history for his children. But George had just proved the opposite. Diana had become part of the way he thought about people. Part of the values he wanted to carry forward. Perhaps even part of the king he hoped to become. William wiped his eyes once more, and placed a hand gently on his arm. George continued walking ahead. And in that moment, William understood the real tribute. It wasn't the flower. It wasn't the envelope. It wasn't even the letter. It was George himself. Diana's grandson had never met her, but her legacy had somehow reached him anyway.